Now, if you're like me, when you first hear that before you actually see the performers on screen, that might have sounded like a flute to you, did it? It did to me when I first got this YouTube clip. And then, of course, and it was labeled Erhu, and because we got the video of the performers eventually after a few seconds, we could see that that very flute-like, that very ethereal sound is coming from this two-string spike fiddle. Now, I assure you that it is a long-standing instrument, a very long history, and that the other instrument in this video, the yangqin, the hammered dulcimer, is also a long-standing historical traditional instrument. But the way that they're presenting the music here, kind of like a Western solo instrumental performer with piano accompaniment. So we have erhu with yangqin accompaniment, and that way of presenting an instrumental piece is very much influenced by Western chamber music. So here's traditional music, traditional ways of playing and ornamenting, but a performance presentation style that is heavily influenced by the West. And so there's that juxtaposition or that counterpoint between tradition and modernity. Now the next video, which is only a minute and a half long, takes that one step further because you actually have a grand piano accompanying a solo erhu player. And so get a sense of this with Western major and minor harmonic system, in this case minor, with the Chinese instrument. And the instrument sounds much closer to a violin kind of timbre in this way of performing than it used to in that folk setting way back in the day. Okay, that brings us to a very important ideological importation for music in China, and that is the idea of the conservatory. So I call this a conservatory paradigm in 20th century China. Now, do you know what a music conservatory is? In the United States, we have the New England Conservatory of Music near Boston. We have one called the Boston Conservatory of Music. Juilliard School of Music and Dance in New York City is a conservatory. So again, I'm referring to the text that we're not using for the online class, but it's the idea of having a college, if you will, post-high school experience where people focus on the musical art. And you can imagine that certain kinds of changes came into Chinese music as a result of adopting that Western idea of classical training for musicians. Of course, you don't need to summarize that like the PowerPoint asks you to because you have not read that text. So let me summarize for you. You have people learning to play instruments, traditional instruments, but in a Western way, a Western expressive way, adopting some aspects of the major-minor system, adapting aspects of what we call chamber ensembles in the West. A very common example that many of you might be familiar with is the idea of a string quartet. We have a standard instrumentation of two violins, a viola, and a cello. And many of the master composers like Mozart, Beethoven, Brahms, Tchaikovsky wrote music for this combination of instruments. And so in China, it was not typical to have a standardized ensemble of instruments, but during this time of the conservatory paradigm, we began to have some standardized ensembles. Another thing we really had was what I call a reinvention of the musical tradition in 20th century China, both in PRC and the ROC. And I want to give you an example of one manifestation of that here, something that has come to be known as the Chinese orchestra. So you have sections of instruments, and they're traditional Chinese instruments or adapted Chinese instruments, but they're set up in sections. So for instance, where you would have a first violin section in the Western orchestra, you have a section of multiple erhu players. Where you would have a cello section, you have a section of Chinese players playing the lower sounding Chinese chordophone. You have Chinese percussion in a section, Chinese winds in a section like the Dieze flute. So take a look at this first 3 minutes of this example to get a sense of how the East and the West come together in this kind of paradigm. Now you might have noticed the title of Internet Symphony or Eroica, and it's by Tan Dun, very well-known Chinese composer who works largely in the West at this point. His music is known in China and in America and throughout the West. He's done movie scores, and it's a beautiful piece. Did you catch a sense of the sweep of that melody and the way the different colors of the instruments in sections just create this beautiful tapestry? Hopefully you also noticed there was a combination of Western percussion instruments and Chinese instruments. You saw timpani or kettle drums that come from the West. You saw what some cultures call the tubular bells from the orchestra. Other people call them the chimes. You saw vibraphone and marimba that are Western African adapted instruments. What else did you see there? You saw a number of Chinese instruments as well. And just a gorgeous presentation. So we're getting into an area where we can best describe these kinds of musical styles as neo-traditional. So they use traditional instruments, they use some of the traditional ornamentation techniques, ways of presenting melody, heterophonic textures sometimes, and so I call it neo-traditional. Now, another thing that was discussed in the text that I'll tell you about here is the silk and bamboo ensemble. So when I describe the Western string quartet with standard instrumentation, we have something that is fairly standard in China now. You can see it in the top photo, where we have an erhu player and a yangqin, a hammered dulcimer player. We have the dizi flute player, and we have the pipa player. Sometimes there are a few extra instruments in that mix, but the standard quartet here is called Siju, Silk and Bamboo Ensemble. And again, for native Mandarin speakers, I apologize for my American tongue trying to pronounce that. Let's take a look at a video of this ensemble and its beautiful music. Now, the texture of that 3 minute piece was largely heterophonic. Did you get a sense of them playing the same melody? The Yang Qin has some extra notes to kind of arpeggiate chords and reinforce the idea of the keynote. You hopefully noticed in that 3 minute example that sometimes certain instruments were foregrounded, sometimes the flute was more in the foreground, and sometimes the erhu fiddle was in the foreground. A few times the pipa might have been foregrounded. And again, just very exciting and energetic music, very well played. Okay, next we see a neo-traditional performance of an ensemble called Baiguan, Wind and Percussion Ensemble. Now, the video here is a little grainy, but you're going to see some very interesting things. You're going to hear brass types of instruments that really sound a drone kind of sound, not melodic playing like a Western trumpet or trombone or French horn, just sounding some drone notes for effect. And then the percussion is doing a lot of exciting, energetic, rhythmic things. Now, let me tell you before you watch it that you're going to see some very modern things, and then we'll talk about it a little bit more after you've watched the video as well. The conductor, rather than using some kind of baton, is using flags, almost like he's sending semaphore signals, flag signals, like they used to do on ocean-going ships. You see things where the performers will move, and it might remind you of an American marching band or drum corps show. So let's watch this, and then we can talk a little bit more about it. Now, I hope you thought that was as cool as I do. Um, those kinds of drums and those instruments might have been used in a Buddhist festival kind of setting back in the day. They might have been used for different kinds of celebrations and observations. And now it's kind of more like a tourist presentation, something in that kind of public setting, and taking on those dimensions of an American drumline type of show. Lots of visuals and lots of different exciting combinations of rhythmic patterns. So very cool.